My name's Herbert Marshall. I was born January the 10th, 1941 at Mock Clinic in downtown Prairie Grove. I was orphaned when I was 4 years old. My mother passed away when I was 4. My grandfather and grandmother, Herbert Marshall and Maud, took me in, and they lived at Mineral Springs, which was east of West Fork. We lived there until I was about 10 years old, and we moved to the Illinois Chapel area, Prairie Grove, and between Prairie Grove and Greenland. At age 14, my grandfather passed away. At age 15, I was living with aunts, uncles. I went to school at Fayetteville, Springdale, West Fork, Prairie Grove, and Greenland. Most of my time was at Greenland. At the age of 15, I had a buddy that was in the Arkansas National Guard, and I went into the Arkansas National Guard at age 15. I transferred my records from the Arkansas National Guard to the Marines, and I went to the Marines. I turned 16 in Marine Corps boot camp. At the end of my boot camp, I was in 29 Palms, California, Marine Station, when they ran a security check on me in order for a security clearance, a top secret or top secret. And they found out how old I was, and they honorably discharged me, and I had like 20 months in the Marines. I came home from the Marine. I married a school sweetheart from West Fork, and after I turned 18, I went back into the service, into the Army, and I served 8 years with the Army, and most of my time in the Army was with the Army Special Forces, also known as the Green Berets. I came home at my end of my second tour in Vietnam in February of '68. I returned home and took a job with King County Sheriff's Department in Seattle, Washington. I worked for King County for about a year and transferred to the Issaquah Police Department, where my home was, where I lived, and worked for Issaquah Police Department for about a year and a half to 2 years, and returned to Washington County with my wife and 4 children, and went to work for Washington County Sheriff's Department, which at the time was my salary was half paid for by the FBI and half my salary was paid for by the Sheriff's Department.
Tell me more about that. You were saying you had your pay was split. Tell us how that worked.
I worked undercover for over a year, about a year, a little more than a year, for Washington County Sheriff's Office. Dick O'Connell was the FBI agent that was my handler at the time. I became a student at the University of Arkansas. The work I was doing for Washington County was for drugs and narcotics, theft of property, of people that I was associating with. For the FBI, it was more for the Weather Underground that I was working with. This was a group of anti-war, most everything for America. I went to one of their meetings at one time. I went into it was a church close to the university, and in the basement we had a meeting. And at that meeting, on one end of the room was a picture of Ho Chi Minh, and on the other end of the room was a picture of Che Guevara. So I knew that the people I was associating with was not good people. I ended up meeting a couple of people from the Chicago 7, and in fact, I got subpoenaed to appear in trial in Florida for the Chicago 7, which as it turned out, there was a plea deal taken, and I didn't have to go to Florida for the testify on it. That was on the FBI half side of it. On the Washington County side of it, while I was working undercover, was primarily drugs and narcotics, dealers that was dealing drugs and narcotics in Washington County at the time. After about a year, I went to the sheriff, and understand, I never showed my face around the sheriff's department during that time frame. Everything was by telephone, directly to the sheriff or to the sheriff's chief deputy. It was the only people that knew who I was at the time. I went to the sheriff after about a year, and I told him that there's some people that's getting kind of suspicious of me because some of the people in the drug business was getting busted, and I was coming out from undercover. So he brought me out from undercover, and I became an investigator then for Washington County Sheriff's Office. And I worked for Bill Long about 2 years, and before I ran for sheriff. Then in the spring of 1974, I ran for sheriff as a Republican because there was nobody running for Republican. And I didn't have much money to invest in it, but I had an old beat up Jeep, and I went ahead and filed to run for sheriff on the Republican ticket. And I ran into a guy, I'm trying to think of his name now. He was the security, well, my mind went blank on his name. He was the security director for Walmart's. And at that time, he took me to meet Sam Walton. And Sam Walton gave me my first donation to run for sheriff. Shoemaker, Jack Shoemaker was his name. Jack took me to Sam Walton. So during the process, Sam Walton asked me, said, how are you gonna, I had to resign from the sheriff's department as an investigator for the sheriff's department at the time in order to run for sheriff, because I couldn't have been running for sheriff against Bill Long at the time. And Bill had an opponent, Bill Murray, that was running against him in a primary. But Sam asked me, he said, how are you going to buy groceries for your family? And I said, well, I haven't figured that out yet, but I'll find something to do to make ends meet. And he looked at Jack Shoemaker and said, have we got any openings in security? And Jack said, yes, we do. To make a long story short on it, I became the district supervisor for security for Walmart's. And Sam himself told me, he said, you don't have to spend but 2 hours a day at each one of at different store each day. I had Eastern Oklahoma, Northwest Arkansas, and Southern Missouri. And what I was teaching was the employees of Walmart's how to catch shoplifters. So many times I've said to myself and I've said to my family, probably one of the worst things that ever happened to me was losing the election or winning the election for sheriff of Washington County, because had I not won the office, I would have went on to higher places with Walmart's in their security. But I did win the election, and in fact, I won it by quite a bit. And one of the reasons that I think that I won it was my telling the public that I didn't believe in politics in law enforcement, and I still don't to this day. I think the sheriff of a county and the prosecutor of a county should be like our judges are now and be nonpartisan, because there is no place in law enforcement for politics if you're going to do your job as a law enforcement officer. I went on to my second term after my first term, and I went on to my third. And my third term, Bud Dennis beat me. I think he beat me by about 800 votes or something like that. But, and that's when I went back into the armed forces. And you always hear this story about the sheriff making this money, having plenty when he leaves office. When I arrived in Great Lakes, and I went back into the Navy, and when I arrived at Great Lakes Training Center, I had 35 cents on me, and that was all the money I had. I owned my truck, I paid it off, and I made sure I never done anything with that. And I spent the next 11 years in the Navy and retired out of the Navy as Chief Petty Officer. And that's where I'm at today. Still retired.
Talk about your second term. Whenever didn't Bud challenge you that first time? Was he working there then? Tell me about your first challenge that you had that you won.
I ran against Bill Murray, who had beaten Bill Long in a primary, and I won that by a large majority. In my second term, I don't have any proof on it, but during my second term, they said I got more votes than any candidate that ever ran. I got 76% of the votes in my second term. That was when I think Bob Bishop, was the one that ran against me on that. Bud had ran twice, and the second time he beat me.
How were you able to run in a staunch Democratic county and win? Part of it, you said you had support from Walton, and I think that the incumbent had been beaten in the primary, but how did you come into a county that was solid Democrat and win so big? What was the key?
I had a lot of Democrat friends that knew me, that knew my military background. I had a very, very good military background, and being born and raised in Washington County, back in those days, if I didn't know you as a person, I knew your uncle, or I knew your aunt, or I knew your cousin. This was back when Washington County was not populated like it is in this day and time. It was complicated for me, and the reason being is because the county didn't have enough people to really run the jail and run the sheriff's department. One of the things that I tried to do was to improve the department by adding personnel at nights. For example, when I was with the sheriff's department, you had Deputy Skinner had everything at nighttime, had everything west of Highway 71. And then either I or another deputy had everything east of Highway 71. So you had two deputies on at night. And sometimes three. If it was a weekend like Friday or Saturday night, we'd have maybe three. You had, usually one was what they called a rover, that would rove around and back up another deputy. But any backup we got was usually from the state police, state patrol. It was difficult because the pay scale was so low at the sheriff's department. the jail, even though they renovated the old National Guard Armory there in Fayetteville, where they called the new jail, on any given day when I was sheriff, I'd have somewhere between 45 and 55 prisoners. And I had one person on duty in the day and one person on duty at night looking after the jail, plus a matron during the daytime. And that was about it. We was short on everything. The old historic jail, the sheriff lived upstairs. He had an apartment, or him and his family lived up in the apartment above that was in the old jail, which is straight across the street from the Federal building. And that was before they renovated the National Guard Armory, the old National Guard Armory. And that's where they put the new jail, then they called the new jail, which was there when I was elected. It's where I went in to the new jail. It was, well, it was quite modern for the time. The only thing that I can remember is that they had a lot of, the trustees was cooking the meals. And I changed that when I went in and hired a cook, a lady that was, I don't know, in her 50s, that came in and cooked every day with the help of trustees to cook the meals.
What were the challenges that the new sheriff faced whenever you left?
Well, personnel shortages, for one. The pay scale would be, this is why when I went into office, one of the first things, and Hollis Spencer, the chief of police at Fayetteville at that time, was a very good friend of mine. And Hollis and I had worked for him for about a year at one time. I left the sheriff's office and then came back to the sheriff's office because I didn't like working in the city where I was restricted to just 10 city blocks. Hollis had told me about, when I went in, the sheriff could hire anybody, put them in uniform and put them on the street. I changed that. And I changed that because I required every man that was on the street working as a deputy sheriff would have gone through the academy. I sent every one of my people to the academy, and I had a hard time convincing the quorum court at the time because of the cost of getting them. And then I had to go back to the quorum court again and explain to them why I lost this guy who went to Fayetteville or Springdale Police Department. And it was because the pay scale, if you went to work for the city of Fayetteville or the city of Springdale, your pay scale went up about $150 a month, $100 to $150. And a man that's got a wife and children, that's quite a bit for him back in that day. So I lost a lot of good men going, which Tim Helder, the sheriff of today, was, I hired him when he was 20 years old. Ray Ward was my chief deputy. And Ray came to me one time and he said, I've got a young man in West Fork that would sure make us a fine deputy. And he told me that his father had been retired from the Los Angeles Police Department, that he's met him through the church. So I said, bring him in, let me interview him. Well, I interviewed Tim Helder at the time and hired him. Well, I couldn't put him on the street or send him to the academy because he wasn't 21 yet. So I put him in dispatch. And when he turned 21, I sent him to the academy. And he got trained in the academy, came back, and like so many others, after about a year, he walked in the office one morning and he said, Sheriff, he said, I hate to tell you this, but I'm be going to the Fayetteville Police Department. And he said, it just really bothers me to have to tell you that. And I said, well, Tim, it shouldn't bother you because I would do the same thing if I was in your shoes. But this was one of the obstacles that I had to get over while in my first couple of years as sheriff, you know. Was that I'd get my people trained up, and as soon as they figured out how to get from Fayetteville to Brentwood, then they'd transfer.
Talk about Sheriff Helder. What's he been like? How did that time at Fayetteville help him to be a better sheriff? I mean, what do you think how has he done in your mind?
In my humble opinion, Tim Helder is one of the finest sheriffs Washington County has ever had. And I would back him 100%. His knowledge, his education, he continued on studying and learning new things as he went along. After he left the sheriff's department, when he got in the city, he went on with his education and learning. And that's what's made him a good sheriff, is that he's been there and done that. And that's what makes a good person. You don't learn everything out of a book, but if you've been there and done it, then you've got a better idea on how to manage people, how to manage a jail, how to manage things. And that's what helped me more than anything when I worked for King County Sheriff's Office in Seattle before. That's where I cut my teeth in law enforcement. I worked in the jail and I worked as patrolman. And up there, the crime was very rampant. So when I got back to Washington County and went to work for Washington County, I had a knowledge of law enforcement and how law enforcement should be handled. Actually, during my tenure as sheriff, I was what I would refer to as a field sheriff. I came in the mornings and done my paperwork, and by 10 or 11 o'clock, I was out in the field working with my men. Anytime we had a bad actor that was armed and dangerous, I was usually the first person through the door. And there was a reason for that. And the reason was that during my tenure in Vietnam, I brought my people back. Some of them was wounded, but I brought them back to the camp. And I would never be able to live with myself if I told a deputy, you all go in there, you boys go in there and get him. And one of them men got killed. So that's how I ran my department. If there was somebody that was extremely dangerous, he had me to deal with rather than one of my deputies. And I'd always tell my deputies, if he kills me, he don't walk out of there.
I know you made the newspaper several times from marijuana raids and other arrests, but talk about in those days what the fight for drugs was like, and maybe how that's changed over the years.
We had a problem with drugs, and I could see it readily because I've seen high school students that were really good students would get involved with drugs, and then within their second term in school, they just went to nothing because of drugs. I saw a lot of, again, going back to my military time, I saw guys in the military that got involved with drugs. I knew what drugs could do to people. We had a serious problem in Washington County on marijuana, methamphetamine, cocaine, and it was getting to the point of where it was rampant. And I got a lot of criticism because of my stance against drugs. And we still got it today. A lot of good people are not the same people they were before they started taking drugs. They get involved in drugs and they go downhill. And it's the same with alcohol. People who gets involved in alcohol, I know some very fine men that went to nothing because of alcohol. And but drugs is the big deal right now. We've got an epidemic right now, I think, an epidemic of drugs in northwest Arkansas.
The population has grown, but the number of people in jail has grown even faster. Why do you think there's so many more now in jail maybe than there was back in the day?
I think a lot of it is people that's coming in here from other areas. I would be willing to bet if you check the roster, the people who they've got in jail right now, a big portion of them came from someplace else. They're not the local homegrown Northwest Arkansas resident. That's second generation, say, or third generation. If they were born and raised in Northwest Arkansas, we have our culture and our heritage carries a long way with us. You don't want to embarrass the family by getting caught up in a drug operation or something.
Talk to me about the prosecutors. Who was your prosecutor when you were in the sheriff's office and as sheriff, and what were they like?
When I was sheriff, Malin Gibson was the prosecutor when I went into office. He was the prosecutor when I was an investigator for the sheriff's office. I've never seen, since then, I've never seen a better prosecutor than Malin Gibson. Malin was fair, even across the board. If your heart was in the right place, he'd been with you. If your heart wasn't in the right place, you're going down the road for a long stretch. And Malin helped me more than any prosecutor in my law enforcement, all of my law enforcement time. There was times when Malin kept me out of trouble. There's things that I wanted to do, and Malin would caution me on it. And I can't say anything more for a fine man. Malin Gibson was a fine man. Then Malin became a judge, and Kim Smith came in, another fine man. I thought the world of Kim Smith, and Kim wasn't. There was something that wasn't quite as sharp as Malin Gibson was. I guess on maybe a personal basis or something. But I thought very highly of Kim Smith during my tenure there. And he made a good prosecutor for Washington County and a good judge, you know.
What about the other chiefs around the counties that you may have dealt with at the cities? Do you remember who they were or how you worked with them?
Joe Sims was chief at Springdale. Very fine man. I worked very close with the cities. I'm trying to think of Glenn Riggins was another fine chief in the city of Fayetteville. I had no problems with the cities as far as law enforcement. I always gave them my men when they needed them, my backup, and they'd always give me their backup when I needed it. The smaller communities, I had good relationships with Lee Terry, very fine man, made a good chief for Prairie Grove. The Lincoln chief, I didn't really have that much interaction with him. I can't even really think of his name right now, but I know Lee Terry, and I had a good working relationship with Dick Hoyt, who was Johnson chief of police at that time. He was a character all of his own, but he was a good guy. He was an old World War II veteran paratrooper, and
Tell me about Dick Hoyt. What was he like?
well, he loved his cigars, and he'd always have a cigar stuck in his mouth, and he was another one that he didn't bend. With Dick, it was his way or the road, and I had a good working relationship with Dick Hoyt, and
Before I get to some of the final questions, do you have anything maybe you wanted to add, maybe stuff I hadn't thought to ask you about, or things that are on your mind about being sheriff?
well, I think they're people of Washington County is faced with the same thing now that I was faced with back then, and that's with the jail situation. I would like to see our state senators and state legislators go to the governor and see if they about getting a regional jail for Northwest Arkansas. You know, I've got another story to tell you. Joe Steele in Springdale was a very good friend of mine, and he owned some property down where the mall is, where Steel Drive is, or whatever they call it down there. He owned quite a bit of property. Joe summoned me one time to his office. I went up there and he said, we're spending an awful lot of money by having a Fayetteville Police Department and a Springdale Police Department and a Sheriff's Department. He said, why don't we put them all under one roof? And I said, well, Joe, what are you really talking about? And he said, I will donate 10 acres of that land between Fayetteville and Springdale to build a new courthouse and a new jail. And he said, I'll donate the land for it. I went to the quorum court, and I brought that up at the quorum court, and it went flat quick. It's like the cities the mayors wanted their control. Well, in other words, it'd be like a lot of other areas in the United States where they pulled together and made what they call Metropolitan Police, which they'd pull in their police departments and make them into one, and their law enforcement agency. The sheriff would still be the sheriff, a chief of police would still be a chief of police, but they'd be under one command. And nobody would even entertain the idea of that. But that's one of the things that happened while I was sheriff. Another thing that I'd like to have seen happen, I'd like to have seen which we tried to get back in those days, the state laboratory to open up a satellite laboratory in Northwest Arkansas at the University of Arkansas, where that our law enforcement in Northwest Arkansas could take their evidence that they had to the crime lab. We wouldn't have to drive all the way. We made so many trips making a quick run to Little Rock, all the way to Little Rock, to put something into the lab, and then it'd be 2 months later when we'd get it back, and it'd be something that would take a crime, not a crime, a lab person. It would have taken them 5 minutes to make the decision on what it was that we were bringing. And it would help us tremendously, and it'd help us tremendously today if we had that. If we had a satellite crime lab, state crime lab in Northwest Arkansas. But I think the Quorum Court of Washington County needs to take a long look, and there's going to be more and more criminals. And the ones that need to be kept in the jail are the ones that's got the long rap sheets. For example, if you picked a guy up today for burglary and theft of property, where you're breaking into people's houses and stealing their stuff, that sounds like he's a nonviolent, but if you look at his rap sheet, he's done it for 15 years. He keeps doing it over and over. One of the things that it sounds strange to some people, we've got too lenient with our prison system. And when I say lenient, I mean everybody's got a TV in their cell. Everybody can make phone calls when they want to make phone calls. I remember a time when I was an investigator for Bill Long, I arrested a guy on burglary in Washington County. He sat down and I told him, I said, you know, I've got you solid. And I said, you're going to go back down south. I said, this will be your third trip. And he looked at me and started crying. Please don't send me back down there. Please don't send me back to prison. And I said, well, I want to clear up a bunch of burglaries that we've had. And I said, if you help me clear up some of these burglaries, then I'll cut you some slack. I'll go to the prosecutor and we'll cut you some slack. And that one individual, I solved over 30 burglaries where they were selling the goods, who his associates was, and he did not want to go back to prison because he told me a story. He said they get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. At 6:30 they have breakfast. At 7 o'clock they're getting on a wagon and they're going to the field. When they get to the field, there's a guy on a horse that's got a rifle on each end of the field. The guy tells them, you're picking cucumbers today. Nobody sits down because of the grass and weeds being so high. You have to bend over. And he said, he looked at me and he said, my back was hurting so bad. He said, I looked around and the guards was looking away in another direction. He said, I just squatted down for a minute. And he said, I heard a horse galloping. He said, one of them grabbed me by one hand, the other one rode up and grabbed me by the other hand. One grabbed me by one hand and one grabbed me by the other hand, and across this field we went, and there was a big tree, big oak tree at the end of the field, and said that tree was coming up fast. And he said, when they let me go, said I slid right up there within 2 foot of that tree. What I'm trying to say is the prison system was so tough that when they got out of there, they didn't want to go back. In 1999, I became chief deputy for Madison County here where we're at now. I arrested a guy in 1999, or maybe, yeah, it was 1999. I arrested a guy who's a known burglar and thief. And I went through the same scenario. I had him in the room and I said, you know, I've got you solid. And I said, you're going to be going back south. He was on parole. He looked at me and just smiled and he said, I don't care. He said, I get to see my old buddies again. That tells me that the prison system is not tough. Prison system needs to be tough to where that once you get out of there, you have no ways that you want to go back. And, you know, and I mentioned this to some people and they, we've got to treat them decent, you know, we've got to do this or do that. I'm not for the strap that we had back whenever I first started working in Washington County, that's when they had a strap they'd actually whip them if they got out of line. I'm not for that. What I am for is they've got a gym to go to every day to play basketball. They watch TV every night in their cell. And they say, well, that's the only way we can control them. Bull, that's crap. You know, let him sit there in that room by himself or with his buddy for day in and day out to the point where that he won't want to go back there again.
If you had to explain to somebody and tell them what Washington County was like, say somebody who'd never been to Washington County, and what would you tell them? How would you describe Washington County?
It's a beautiful place to live. Of course, I'm a little, I lean a little that way because I'm fifth generation in Northwest Arkansas. My people came here in late 1830s to Newton County and then migrated from Newton County to Washington County. I was born and raised here. This is home to me. And I love it very dearly. And I think anybody that would ever come to Washington County would love it as much as I do because of the beauty, the seasons we have here, it's just a wonderful place to be.
All right, one more question. We're almost done here. How would you finish this sentence?
How to what?
How would you finish this sentence? My favorite thing about Washington County is...
Well, it's not like it used to be. There's an old saying, you can't go back, but I sure wish we could go back when it was a little laid back college town and everybody knew everybody, but I know we're not going to go there. I think that Washington County, they've got a good system set up. They're doing pretty good with it. I don't agree with a lot of the things that's going on. Again, I'm going to get slammed for it when I say it, but it seems like we're spending millions of dollars on bicycle trails and walking trails. I mean, millions of dollars. And when you drive into Fayetteville now, you see maybe 2 bicycles. So what in my own personal thoughts, and I could be wrong, we've got such beauty here in Northwest Arkansas. It's beautiful scenery, beautiful place to be. But if we spend these millions of dollars on bicycle trails when right now in Northwest Arkansas, our traffic, automobile traffic, is like gridlock. If you happen to be in Fayetteville at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or in Springdale or Rogers or anywhere else, it's like a gridlock. We need more highways, better highways going around some of these cities than we do going right down through the middle of them. The money that's being used on bicycle trails, a lot of it is being donated by the Walton Foundation. But they put a deal on it, we'll donate this much money, but the city and the county has to match it. Well, when we match it, that's people's tax dollars. And building something that only 1% to 2% of the population is using. And if you don't believe me, go out to one of these bicycle trails and sit there for 2 hours and tell me how many bicycles you see go by. To me, yes, it's nice to have. Yes, it's wonderful and it's great. But I think we need to use our tax dollars to the best, where it's going to benefit most of the public, the majority of the public. And that's how I see a lot of tax dollars being wasted in Fayetteville and Springdale and other places because of a feel-good thing versus what we really need.
Anything else?
Well, we've got a wonderful university, and go Hogs go. We're going to hope we do great this year.